So Marco Rubio was confirmed by the Senate 99-0. And when you have those unanimous confirmations, it's either really good or really bad. And I think the jury is still going to be out on Marco Rubio, although he is saying things that I like. He's saying things that reflect the Trump agenda, and it's given me hope that over the last 8 years since he first battled Trump, that he has moved more toward the MAGA movement and away from that establishment neocon republicanism that he was espousing back in 2015. And he's certainly better than his predecessor, Antony Blinken, who really had a horrifying 4 years as the Secretary of State. And there was a article from the New York Times recently that even referred to him as the Secretary of War because of his approach to Israel and Gaza and the Ukraine war. But what I want to do is read a short portion from the New York Times, because they basically say he is one of the reasons why the Ukraine war was not settled back in 2022. And that being the case, in 2025, Ukraine is in a much worse negotiating position than they were back then, in addition to having lost, more importantly, hundreds of thousands of men. So Antony Blinken, in my opinion, has a lot of blood on his hands and really was a terrible Secretary of State. So the bar is not very high for Marco Rubio, and based on some of the things Rubio has said, I think he'll be a much better, improvement. And after I read that article, I want to play two clips, one from Blinken and one from Rubio. And these are snippets of their introductory speeches after they got confirmed as Secretary of State, when they went to the State Department and met with the employees there. And what I want you to listen to is their tone and how they sort of view their mission as the Secretary of State, because I think there's a very, very big contrast between the two. But first, let's start with the New York Times article, because for somebody who's supposed to be the nation's diplomat, being called the Secretary of War by the New York Times is pretty telling. So, how Antony Blinken, America's top diplomat, became the Secretary of War. President Biden's longtime aide rallied scores of nations to defend Ukraine, but then became a villain to the many critics of U.S. support for Israel's war in Gaza. Now, one thing that is fascinating about how Blinken is being talked about here is that, according to some very prominent Republican conservative supporters of Israel, the Biden administration is anti-Semitic. Yet here we have the New York Times saying that Blinken, in many ways, is a villain, according to them, or according to the critics, because of his support of the war in Israel. So how do you have those two coexist? He's a villain for supporting Israel, but according to some very prominent conservatives, he's an anti-Semite, despite the fact that he himself is Jewish, so I guess he would be a self-hating Jew. So when it comes to Israel and whether or not you support their war in Gaza, you get some very, very strange opinions that are very far from each other. And it's unfortunate because we can't really have a rational discussion on Israel and our support for Israel because of the fanaticism on all sides. So that one topic is just exhausting for me personally, because, again, there is no rational discussion about Israel. But the article says, concerning the Ukraine war, his moment, Blinken, came when President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. As Mr. Putin was building up for the assault, Mr. Blinken delivered a speech in Berlin invoking how Presidents John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan had stood up to Soviet power and declared that the United States would again defend the governing principles of international peace and security. A day later in Geneva, he faced down his grim Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, warning that a Russian attack would draw a swift, severe, and united response. And when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark A. Milley, suggested in late 2022 that Ukraine should capitalize on battlefield gains by seeking peace talks with Moscow, Mr. Blinken insisted the fight should go on. Visiting Kiev in May, Mr. Blinken, a guitar player, took the stage at a packed music club and led a local band in a rendition of Neil Young's Rocking in the Free World. The defense of Ukraine had offered him a literal rock star moment. And that was a moment that I personally found to be incredibly embarrassing as an American when your Secretary of State goes to a country at war where young men are being pulled off the streets and forced to the front. He's going there for his rock star moment, playing his guitar in some nightclub in Kiev. Very embarrassing. But again, Secretary of War. He was big on the Ukraine war, and he facilitated the war in Israel as well. And he did not really bring that much peace and stability to this planet, Antony Blinken. So I think his legacy is not going to be good. Now, I want to play Blinken back in 2021 when he first addressed the State Department. And again, I want you to listen to his tone and sort of how he views the organization and their mission. And then later I'll play the clip from Marco Rubio. I find it very interesting.
We at State have a role to play in all of this. And I believe it starts with rebuilding morale and trust. This is a priority for me because we need a strong department for the United States to be strong in the world. To that end, we have to invest significantly in building a diverse and inclusive State Department. We need the most talented people. We need the most creative workforce. We cannot do our job of advancing America's interests, values, and commitment to democracy without a State Department that is truly representative of the American people. Now, I can't promise that you will support every choice I make as your secretary. But I can promise an open door and an open mind. I'll be forthright with you because transparency makes us stronger. I'll seek out dissenting views and listen to the experts because that's how the best decisions are made. And I will insist that you speak and speak up without fear or favor. And I will have your back. The American people are watching us too. They want to see that we're safeguarding their well-being, that we care about their interests, that our foreign policy is about them and their lives. We will do right by them by pursuing a foreign policy that delivers real benefits to American families, protects their safety, advances their opportunities, honors their values, and leaves their children and grandchildren a healthier and more peaceful world.
So he didn't leave us a healthier and more peaceful world, Antony Blinken. He left a disaster. And one thing I noticed when I watched his entire speech, I obviously didn't play the whole thing, he's very focused on the organization, not really as much on the mission of the organization. He is about the institutions. And as a deep stater, as a member of permanent DC, that's sort of what you would expect from Antony Blinken. And as a reminder, Blinken was a supporter of the Iraq War when he worked for the Senate. And in 2020, he was responsible for the letter that Biden used at the debate that said that the Hunter Biden laptop was disinformation. He was the one who got all those intel heads together to sign that letter and create that letter. So Blinken helped Biden get elected, and then Biden turned around and made him Secretary of State. So, Blinken is a member of the team in D.C., and under him, again, it was just neocon foreign policy, which has been a disaster for decades now. So, Blinken, a disaster. Now, here is the clip from Marco Rubio, and I was encouraged by what he said, his tone, what he's focused on, And I think it's a huge contrast to Blinken. So here is the clip from Marco Rubio that's making me more hopeful that he will be supporting a foreign policy that actually makes sense.
I am new to this department. Today is my first day on the job, literally, but I am not a stranger to it. I've interacted with many of you, both in my travels abroad and in our daily functions. My job now is different, and our job in some ways will be different. In our republic, the voters decide the course of our nation, both domestically and abroad, and they have elected Donald J. Trump as our president when it comes to foreign policy on a very clear mission. And that mission is to ensure that our foreign policy is centered on one thing, and that is the advancement of our national interest, which they have clearly defined through his campaign as anything that makes us stronger or safer or more prosperous. And that will be our mission. That will be our job across the world, is to ensure that we have a foreign policy that advances the national interest of the United States. I expect every nation on earth to advance their national interests. And in those instances, and I hope there will be many, in which our national interest and theirs align, we look forward to working with them. This is in many ways, and again it was referenced by President Trump yesterday in his speech, that he designs, that his overriding goal for global policy is the promotion of peace, the avoidance of conflict. And no agency will be more critical in that regard than this one.
Isn't that nice? Rubio says the voters set the agenda by who they voted for, and the agenda that President Trump has as far as his foreign policy is peace through strength, but a emphasis on having peace. So I like that. I like that Rubio connected that to the voter and says our job here is to work for the voter. That's its focus, the mission. And the mission is the mission that we, the people, send them on when we voted for President Trump. So I really like to hear that from Marco Rubio.
In fact, it's its founding principle and purpose. And that's what we endeavor to do, to promote peace around the world, because that's in our national interest. Without peace, it is hard to be a strong nation, a prosperous nation, and one that is better off. But there will also be challenges. We recognize that there will be those times, unfortunately, as humans interact with one another because of our nature. But there will be conflict. We will seek to prevent them and avoid them, but never at the expense of our national security, never at the expense of our national interests, and never at the expense of our core values as a nation and as a people. We are, at the end of the day, a nation founded on a powerful principle. And that powerful principle is that all men are created equal, because our rights come from God, our Creator, not from our laws, not from our governments. And we hope the entire world can one day live under that, and we will always, always be strong defenders of that principle. Never at the expense of our national interest, never at the expense of pragmatic foreign policy, never at the expense of the reality that oftentimes in foreign policy, our choices are not between a bad option and a good option. Sometimes in foreign relations, our options are two bad ones, and we're just trying to figure out which one of them is least bad. And that's unfortunate, but it is true. And that's a tough job. It's our job, and we'll seek to do it right and well. That is the core mission of this agency, and it will be the core mission while Donald Trump is president, and we will be effective on his behalf.
So I like to hear that. He keeps on referencing Donald Trump and Donald Trump's foreign policy and saying that the mission of the State Department is to work on what Donald Trump has said, which is, again, peace through strength, but the mission being peace. And another thing he said as well that I really liked him say was that sometimes you have two bad options and you have to pick the least worst. And when it comes to Israel and Palestine, when it comes to the Ukraine war, that's very much likely going to be our options there, between a bad option and one that's not as bad. And that's being pragmatic and being realistic and understanding that you can't always get the way you want because you have to deal with other actors out there who you don't have control over. So that is a good attitude to have if you're going to try to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, for example, understanding that the result's not going to be great, but that's life. And all you're trying to do is make things a little better than they were before. It won't be great, but it will be better. So Marco Rubio making sense, being rational, and most importantly, saying that the Department of State is working through us or working for us and are going to follow the plan and the vision laid out by the person who we voted for, and that person is Donald Trump. So I hope he's sincere. I hope he does good things And he does have a challenge in front of him with this Ukraine war, but I at least see him moving in the right direction, so that gives me some hope. So good luck, Marco Rubio. I hope you are very successful. Well, that is it for now. If you are new to my channel, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.